Right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to some of you. Good middle of the night, as we'll find out in a second. I'm Harlan Cohen, Gabriel M. Wilner / UGA Foundation Professor in International Law and Faculty Co-Director of the Dean Rusk International Law Center at the University of Georgia School of Law. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this panel on the geopolitics of economic competition. We are grateful to the American branch of the International Law Association and to the organizers of International Law Weekend for the opportunity to discuss these issues with you today. Now, if you're here, you've probably read the panel description, but just in case, let me just give you a sense of what we're all here to talk about. Now, once upon a time when we read physical newspapers, I know that's quite a quaint concept, we would think in terms of sections, right? World news might be where we would turn for global security issues. We might look to the business section for the latest on Wall Street or Silicon Valley. We might look at the Science Times for developments in technology and medicine or the environment. Increasingly, though, reading the news in the morning, the sections can feel jumbled and confused. Tech companies everywhere are being scrutinized by government as potential national security concerns, with new regulators and new tools emerging to monitor threats. Foreign investment, once welcomed, is viewed warily. Countries around the world, from the EU to China to the United States, are actively rethinking how exposed their companies should be to foreign investors. Supply chains, seemingly more fragile than ever, are being reframed as national security concerns, fueling in turn renewed interest in industrial policy. Just see this morning's New York Times. From India to Japan to South Korea, the United States, China, pretty much almost everywhere, foreign companies seem caught in geopolitical crosshairs. Educational and scientific exchanges, once encouraged, are now scrutinized by law enforcement. It used to be that if we read about the arrest of a scientist, it would sound like something crazy. Now that no longer seems so surprising. And all of this comes at a time when the definition of security seems simultaneously slippery and capacious, right? Last week's national intelligence estimate, for example, focused on the national security implications of climate change. And as I learned from Sarah this morning, there are now proposals on the table to add the Department of Agriculture permanently to investment screening, something we might hear more about. It almost seems like there's only one section to the newspaper right now, national security, with every story written in bold print and with lots of exclamation points. Now, there are many aspects of these specific stories we can focus on, and trust us, we will. But we hope this roundtable is a chance to reflect on this broader phenomenon, right? Where are we right now? How are the borders between security, competition, and cooperation being redefined? How do we find our way through this new terrain? How do we navigate a world in which any of our activities, from advising businesses to teaching students, might be seen as matters of national security? Now, we are very lucky to have with us a brilliant and esteemed panel coming to us literally from around the world today with deep and ranging expertise on these topics. Just going in alphabetical order, Lauren Brown is an associate in the international trade practice at Squire Patton Boggs, with experience advising clients on export controls, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, I'm sure that will come up a lot, government contracts, and a range of security-related regulatory matters. Sarah Bowerly-Dansman is Assistant Professor of International Studies at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington, and an expert on the political economy of international investment and finance. From 2019 to 2020, she was a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow working at the State Department as a policy advisor and foreign investment security case analyst in the Office of Investment Affairs. Maggie Lewis, coming to us today from Taiwan, is professor of law at Seton Hall University Law School. Her article, Criminalizing China on the Department of Justice China Initiative, is available as part of the CLE materials for this session. And Enrique Choar Moraes is Deputy Head of Mission at the Embassy of Brazil in New Zealand. In his personal and scholarly capacity, in which he speaks today, Enrique has been at the forefront of a renewed study of geoeconomics. So welcome, everyone. We're going to conduct this as a roundtable. I'll ask some questions to get things started, and we'll take a few turns to get a conversation going. As things progress, I'll look to the audience Q&A and try to integrate those in. I should also note that this panel is being offered for CLE. Towards the end of our initial discussions, I'll post and read the CLE code. I've been told to tell you that in order to obtain the CLE credit, you will need to write down the code and enter it in the CLE affirmation form available on the conference landing page. I've also been asked to stress to you that you will not be able to receive CLE credit without the code, and that the code will not be provided after the panel. Attendees should submit the completed form by November 12th to ilw@ila-americanbranch.org with the subject line as CLE. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get started. Now, many will look at the trends that we're talking about and ask whether there's really anything new here. I've gotten this question quite a few times. I'm sure you have as well. Economics and security have always been intermingled. Trade and investment have always been at the center of geopolitical disputes. All of us on this panel, though, I think, sense that there is something, if not entirely new, different going on right now. So just to start things off, in your view, what's changed? How are threats being defined today? What are states worried about? And maybe we can start with Enrique and then move on to perhaps Sarah, Maggie, and anybody else who wants to jump in before moving on in the conversation.
Great, thanks, Harlan, and thanks for the organizers for the invitation, and to yourself as well. Maybe since I'm kicking off the debate, I start with a really broad view of how almost conceptual of how I see things, and I think throughout my the points that I'll lay out, you will see what for me has changed, how threats are being defined, and what states are worried about. I think it's important to start by recognizing that the global economic governance and international economic law, as we have been trained in, is a system of rules and institutions that have put market-led economic interdependence at the forefront. So market actors instead of states would lead the way to build the economic interdependence networks that we see today. So in this sense, the system has worked very well. We, of course, know many results emerge from the market-led economic interdependence, but one of them, which of course stands out today, is that one of the big winners of market-led economic interdependence has been China. Globalization has enabled China to rise not only as an economic power, but also as a military power and maybe a soft power. So these are, I think, for me, assumptions that are important to understand where we are today. Now, what has changed in my view? I think 2 points are important as I look to where we are now compared to where we were, say, 10 years ago. I think first there's a perception that China's rise has brought about a spillover of capabilities to China and away from key economies such as the US and the EU. Now, what do I mean by capabilities? For me, this is a broad idea that encompasses from the capacity to manufacture semiconductors, to pharmaceuticals, but also to produce knowledge. And of course, the definition of which capabilities are important to maintain or not, it is a topic for a political domestic debate, which is happening at this point in time in the US, in the EU, in Japan, and many other countries. But there is this perception that China's rise has somehow taken place to the detriment of the stock of capabilities detained by key economies. So when we look at what one of the effects of COVID-19, when you see that many countries simply could not or didn't have a stock of masks, not to mention vaccines or pharmaceuticals in general, this is what I mean concretely by a spillover capabilities away from key economies. Now, what is very important in this point, in this perception that China's rise has brought about a spillover of capabilities, is that this is a perception that it's, for me, more clearly manifest in the governing sectors of these economies, not necessarily in the business communities. And I think for me, this explains some of the disconnect between some policies adopted in a number of countries and the reaction of the business communities in these same countries. I think this is an important key to try to understand some of the things that we are witnessing today. And this is also new because we, in the system that has been in place for at least the mid-1990s, we have grown accustomed to the fact that what was good for the companies was good for the country, and vice versa. Let's say the GM, what's good for GM is good for the US. There was a convergence. The perception is that there was a convergence of interest between markets and states, and diplomats would pursue the interests that ultimately would also be interests of their business communities. Now we see a disconnect here. Now the second point, and I'm getting close to my final initial remarks, about what has changed is that because governing elites, if you will, changed their perception with respect to the benefits and risks of market-led interdependence, governments are taking an active role in, let's say, reshaping the economy. So you see not only, let's say, defensive measures become more frequent, such as investment screening and export controls, but also proactive measures such as industrial policies, because some of them are meant to protect capabilities, say investment screening. Others are meant to foster capabilities, say, for example, when USICA stipulates that the semiconductor industry in the US will be given something in the range of $50 billion. So you're trying to foster or improve, let's say, a capability that you already have. Now, these anxieties that drive government measures, I think they're even more important as we enter a period where, let's say, the shape of the future economy is being defined today. So now, again, speaking from a broader perspective, we are seeing who will be the actors that will shape the digital economy, how data will be governed, who will lead in the green energy. And I think this only adds more complexity, because you're not only talking about challenges that can be defined as security threats, but also maybe challenges that can be defined as something less than security, but strategic challenges, such as who will detain the technologies to, say, manufacture semiconductors or solar panels or EV batteries and so on. So for me, this is the broad picture as I see, and that for me is what has changed. Thank you.
Sarah, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. So thank you, Harlan, for organizing this panel and for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here and to talk with such really knowledgeable people about this issue. And Enrique, I think that your opening remarks really, in many ways, mirror some of my own kind of thoughts here. So I would start by saying that the kind of fundamental issue from my perspective and from like a political economy perspective is that the kind of post-World War II rules that shaped the ways in which governments and markets have interacted on the global stage were really created for a world in which the international players that were expected to participate in that system would largely agree on a set of organizing principles that no longer holds, right? So these principles are, it's market-based economies, a lot of separation between private firms and governments. If there is state ownership in the economy, it's very clear to see it, as opposed to more informal ties between governments and firms. Of course, rules oriented, and to some extent, but with some important exceptions, the expectation of some level of democratic governance. And so the rules that were kind of developed, right, are really just not adept with dealing with a large power that engages the market-based system, but from a state-led model. And that's what we have right now. And so what the problem this creates is that it creates economic issues with respect to what extent are firms engaging and competing on a level playing field. But the kind of other concern that I think is more prevalent and that Enrique mentioned is that this kind of use of a market-led system, but through a state-led frame, suggests that governments may be using their firms and even private firms for instrumental strategic policy objectives. And because the rules that were created that really helped develop our global economy did not really anticipate this, because at the time that they were created, the Soviet Union was really, excluded from that system and did not want to participate in it. We have a mismatch, and our global order is trying to figure out how to accommodate that, or how it needs to change in order to meet the kind of new issues and problems that this mismatch creates. And when you add to that a growing concern about distributive effects of globalization, especially in the context of the perception that there is this kind of big state, I mean, I don't need to hide the ball here, China, right, that has really benefited enormously from engaging in a system that welcomed it in, but that it has not changed in the way that it was expected that it would, right? That this then leads to more demands at the domestic level for government intervention and guidance, in terms of those industrial policies that Enrique mentioned, to try to bring back some of the gains back into domestic economies that feel that they have not benefited, or that benefits of globalization and costs have not been kind of equitably distributed. And so as you bring governments into these industrial policies and have them become more integrated into research and development and so forth, that also creates issues in which now, through the digital transformation that governments are now participating in more through industrial policy, you can think of data as a resource that can be weaponized. And that really creates a reimagining of both the risks associated with these types of economic engagements, as well as a shift in how governments, but I'd say a little bit less right now, firms are thinking about their risk appetites. And the one other thing I'll say here before giving others a chance to chime in is that I think that something that's really interesting here is that as the risk sort of expands in terms of what we think of as being national security risks, and as the risk appetite declines, the way that governments are frequently thinking about these risks are largely through the frame of the risk of an economic transaction proceeding. And there's less of an emphasis on the risks associated with economic transactions not occurring. And that's a really interesting shift in how governments are thinking about these issues.
Maggie or Lauren, do you want to come in on this question at all, or?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in as the China studies person. China, yeah. So what's changed? China has changed, and the United States' response to China has changed in some ways that worry me greatly. So I think back when I was working in a law firm in Beijing in the 1990s, our intellectual property concerns, one of our clients was Thai Inc., which, if you remember, made Beanie Babies, those ridiculous little stuffed animals that went for like gazillions of dollars on eBay. And they were being pirated at absurd rates. And so they kept trying to put holograms on them and like heat sensors. Charlene Barshevsky got caught with too many in her luggage when she was negotiating the WTO accession. But it all seems so quaint now, right? Because it wasn't about AI and, dominance in whatever 5G or whatever G we're on now. And so, yes, we now have the United States has a near peer competitor. But with that, there's been, I think, this securitization of the relationship, which there's different views on this, believe is an over securitization of the relationship, where economic security is increasingly becoming synonymous with national security. And so for me, and I teach criminal justice, and where I see this, I'm happy to get more into the weeds later, is with, even, under Obama and earlier, concerns about economic espionage. And this is trade secret theft, so intellectual property theft, but where the intended beneficiary is a foreign country or an entity closely affiliated with the government. that was already on the rise. But the Trump administration just, put that in neon lights, bold, double underline with the China initiative and made it very clear that the concern was not just old school kind of John le Carre spying, but that there are these non-traditional collectors, researchers, professors, students who are being incentivized and perhaps even instructed, but certainly incentivized to engage in talent plans and other activities that were funded by the PRC government to bring research back, to bring intellectual property back. And that's led to a string of not just investigations, but an arrest, but prosecutions, and a number of them which are not doing well because it turns out that some of them were not fully baked. But I see both, yes, there are reasons to be concerned about Xi Jinping's push for indigenous innovation, for his push to pull talent into China, which the US is kind of giving him a nice push, some people out the door to go back there. But I think the US in some ways has not been smart about how it's responding to that economic competition, which does have national security implications, but not everything about it is a national security issue. So I'll just put that out there to start.
Okay, great, and I think that will actually take us into the next round of questions. One thing I'll just add here. I mean, it's in many ways it picks up on themes that you've already raised, but I think it might put this in a slightly different from a slightly different perspective, because I also want to bring in some of the concerns here that are clearly on the table when we think about national security, about things like the environment. And what I hear in across all of what all of you have been saying is, there's an anxiety here, right? And it's an anxiety that's produced in large part by the fact that the future seems to feel more uncertain than it has felt in a long time across a wide range of things. So one thing which we're all picking up when we talk about China here is that the particular distribution of power in the world is shifting. And that's leading to some uncertainty about who's going to get to dictate the rules going forward, who's going to be able to call the shots, whether it's business shots or it's security shots. But it's also connected with uncertainty about things like AI, right? So Sarah, you were raising this, and Maggie, you're kind of alluding to this in other ways with regards to some of the things that are being investigated. I don't think we really know where AI is leading or what the technological future is. And that creates a certain degree of anxiety about what it is that we need to worry about, right? We're not just worried about something, we're worried about what we should be worrying about. And in the environment kind of fits in here too, right? There's a sense that climate change is going to produce certain ruptures. It's already producing certain ruptures, but I think there's a certain level of uncertainty about what those ruptures will be. All of that, I think, is leading perhaps to some sense that we need to take an extra careful look at risks, right? And I think that may be leading to some of the changes that are going on here. But with that on the table, right? So we're talking about the ways in which risk is being rethought. Obviously, this is having regulatory effects, right? What are you watching? What are you looking at here? And maybe Lauren, I could have you start here.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much. Very excited to be here. I do want to open though with a rebuttal that Beanie Babies were not ridiculous. Just need to get that on the table at the outset. But to kind of build off of what was just said, by title, I am an international trade associate, which should encompass the world. But realistically, I walk around with this huge asterisk that unless I say otherwise, I'm talking about China. And I think that says a lot of kind of the approach that we've taken to the securitization of trade and to a lot of our trade priorities. But really, when we're talking about sort of how these evolving anxieties and evolving definitions of threat have made their way down to the practice level of enforcement, we're looking kind of at three things. And it's important to note that everything is happening right now in this sort of context of relative uncertainty. We have about 5 bullet points from the Biden administration as to what the China trade policy is. China has the new regulation. We've not seen them enforced, so we don't know what that's going to look like. And the Biden administration has also said just quite bluntly that it's not prioritizing other free trade agreements in favor of domestic priorities. So when we're looking at what to watch and kind of see where this movement's happening, we're really just kind of following breadcrumbs in a lot of ways. But there are some breadcrumbs. There is some guidance with export controls and sanctions. list-based sanctions are here to stay, and they're probably going to be the favorite tool of the Biden administration for a lot of different reasons. It provides this sort of more targeted approach to dealing with these anxieties. It's been tremendously effective when you look at Huawei and SMIC specifically with the entity list. Within sanctions, we are seeing kind of a coalescence around two sort of key ideas. One is human rights violations, particularly with forced labor abuses against the Uyghur minority. And then the one that really speaks, I think, more to the anxieties that we have, really anything tangentially related to the Chinese military. And, that is a broad-reaching organization in China and in areas directly adjacent to China. And so that is a pretty broad of where we're seeing a lot of these list-based sanctions coming in. Moving on to CFIUS, we mentioned investments. Just a few years ago, when I would mention CFIUS, I could just kind of see the glaze descend on my audience. It didn't stop me though. I was great at happy hours. I kept talking about CFIUS no matter how much people didn't care. But now I'm actually not the one to bring it up. People are talking about CFIUS. They're talking about these restrictions on investment in the United States. And part of that is the expansion of CFIUS in general with its scope. But I think a huge part of it is that you're seeing CFIUS becoming more and more willing to temporally spread its wings and review transactions, as is in its purview, years after closing. And the key there is that when the committee reviews a transaction, it reviews it in the context of threat and anxiety that exists at the time of review, not at whenever the transaction actually closed. So suddenly, something, say, for example, masks, that would be relatively innocuous, they're a very high profile sort of focus of CFIUS. So you're seeing it really being in the forefront of deal makers' minds when previously it was, if anything, sort of a side note that maybe the lawyers made them talk about. And then finally, something that's really interesting is that as we have this gap of sort of direct guidance from the Biden administration, you're seeing an increased scrutiny and increased pressure from the Hill on commerce's licensing and listing practices. Representative McCall released the statistics on Huawei and SMIC. There was the inevitable sort of rise to arms over the numbers, dollar amounts. And so commerce is in this kind of unusual position where they're almost having to defend every single licensing and listing decision they make or don't make. And so what's happening is commerce is no longer willing to make these marginal calls. And so when you have this sort of expanded anxiety, you're really having commerce double down on the hard, clear lines. And so that's had a pretty tremendous impact as we go forward and as we kind of see how it can possibly develop through the Biden administration and beyond.
Could I just jump in for a second? Because I don't know if everyone listening knows what SMIC is, because they might not speak our language, the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation. It's the Chinese, the PRC semiconductor company. And I know this because I'm in Taiwan. And so we talk a lot about TSMC, which is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is one of the most important companies most Americans have never heard of. Hugely important. And so going to the, just to make clear on the strategic side, this is a national security issue because the US needs semiconductors, and TSMC makes the really tiny ones because tiny is better for this. And you don't want, or from the US government perspective, you don't want TSMC to be in Beijing's hands. And so this is also on the table with the how does trade work in Taiwan. So, but anyways, that's what SMIC is, if anyone was wondering what this mysterious SMIC.
That's really helpful. I think that's actually really helpful in showing one of these connections between very clear geopolitical concerns and some of these what seem like economic concerns. With CFIUS on the table, though, I mean, Sarah, I think we have to come to you. I mean, you have experience with this, but also you're watching many other things as well. What else are you watching?
Well, I'd also like to kind of, make sure that we put on the table here, because I think that so often, we start talking about broadly what's happening in the world, and then we narrow down to US, China. And in trade, that oftentimes makes a lot of sense. There's a US-China trade war. There isn't really the same type of trade war happening in other areas. But investment screening mechanisms are not just happening in the United States, right? That over the last few years, we've seen the imposition of brand new mechanisms or the strengthening of existing authorities throughout the advanced industrial world, not just in the United States. We see this with the EU and member states. We see this with the UK, with Australia, Japan, South Korea, and we also see that that many of these kind of these new legal authorities have been made in response to very specific investments that are, very specific laws that have been passed in China, and China has also passed new authorities recently in response to these screening mechanisms. And so therefore, I want to just kind of put that in context. In terms of what we think, what I'm looking at in particular when it comes to CFIUS is how CFIUS is starting to really apply its authorities in a more aggressive or assertive fashion when it comes to deciding what types of investment it has authority over. So for example, there has been in the news one particular transaction in which a Chinese firm is trying to buy a South Korean firm. And the US is reviewing that through CFIUS only because the South Korean firm Magnachip is listed on a US stock exchange, but it has no US business presence otherwise. So that's really interesting because as we see kind of extraterritoriality being used in these mechanisms, and as these mechanisms proliferate throughout the system, the question becomes, how can a kind of large multinational firm ever kind of engage in and complete an acquisition again, because they're going to need to receive a clearance through multiple investment screening mechanisms, and different countries are going to have different kind of concerns that may not be able to be simultaneously met.
Great, thanks. And I'll just say, I mean, I think it's really great that you got that on the table, that this is happening worldwide. I mean, I'll just note, and I know Enrique is following this as well. If anybody in the audience is interested in seeing the ways in which national security is being redefined, right? I mean, by redefined, I mean the actual definition is being changed, right? Investment screening mechanisms is like the canary in the coal mine here, right? I mean, you can just look at all the different ways in which countries are rewriting their investment screening, and you can see the way in which they're actually thinking about what national security should include. Maggie, you were talking already a little bit about the China initiative. Is there anything else that you'd like to put on the table in terms of enforcement things that you're watching?
Yeah, so again, I'm criminal justice and also human rights. And so I'm happy at some point if people do want to talk about the situation in Xinjiang and how that's playing out in DC with the forced labor, legislation, but that's a whole nother ball of issues. But with the China initiative, so I spend most of my career criticizing Beijing, and so I'm fully aware of all the bad things they do. And the PRC government has some intentions which are definitely not just in competition with in a fair and free way with the United States, but we should be concerned about some of the methods being used. So I want to be clear-eyed that there is there are threats. But under the Trump administration, as I said, then AG Jeff Sessions, this feels so long ago in a galaxy far, far away, stood up and said, and we're going to make this thing called the China Initiative. That will be, and the people driving the bus are the National Security Division. And guess what? We need to be really concerned about the threat from China and speaking very clearly about a Chinese threat, a China threat. Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, famously saying sometimes it's every 12 hours, sometimes it's every 10 hours, but that China-related cases are opened, a couple times a day. And then what we've seen, and again, it started under Obama, but really, the pedal hit the floor there under Trump, is putting especially people who have ties to China, many of which, of course, either themselves are ethnically Chinese and or sometimes currently PRC nationals or naturalized US citizens, under the microscope. There have been successful prosecutions, but most of these are not economic espionage. They're for research security issues that end up being for charges like false statements. So that someone had a grant from the National Science Foundation or NASA, and they were supposed to declare that they had contacts or relationships in China, and they didn't. Wire fraud. But some of these cases are falling apart. Most recently, Ming Hu, a professor at the University of Tennessee, who over 2 years was investigated by the FBI, went to trial on 6 counts of wire fraud and false statements, hung jury. The government said they were going to retry. Before the retrial occurred, the judge issued a judgment of acquittal, saying that even viewing the evidence in a light most favorable to the government, no rational juror could say that the government had met its burden of evidence for these charges. So unusual to see that coming out of a judge. And then it comes out that the FBI special agent relied on things like Google to do his work. So, under Trump, I was more concerned about explicit bias and the way that also this happened at the same time as COVID and other really sort of anti-China sentiments. Under the Biden administration, we're seeing the China initiative continue. The messaging is better. It's not as worrisome and sort of the narrative, but I still see a lot of concerns about implicit bias, unconscious bias, and how people who are connected to China by virtue of their characteristics as a human being are, I think, putting them in enhanced scrutiny. And what we're seeing now is concerns about a brain drain, that if you're told you could be looked at with enhanced scrutiny, guess what? They're going back to China, and their grad students are not coming to join them in the United States. So we're also having pipeline concerns for what we're going to have for the brains that are going to be the professors in the US in 10, 20, 30 years from now.
Thanks. Enrique, do you want to come in here on this? I think maybe you might be able to broaden the field a little bit to move us beyond the US and China.
Thank you. Thanks, Harlan. Yes, so maybe I could start by giving some examples on how enforcement is being modified, and then look at something about the idea of breadcrumbs that Lauren raised, which I find is interesting. For example, when we look at the European, how the EU is trying to adapt its approach to cope with these new, I don't know if I would call it threats, but these new developments in, for example, subsidies. There are 2 interesting cases that show how the EU, with its very rule of law DNA preoccupation of framing everything in a legal and rule of law abiding way, is reacting. You might have seen that the EU some time ago imposed countervailing duties over products that were coming from Egypt, but that for the EU were being subsidized also by China. So you were talking, it was an interesting case where the Chinese government was subsidizing a Chinese company in Egypt exporting to the EU, and the EU applied its, they interpreted their CVD, the countervailing duties rules, to address this case where this company exporting from Egypt was being subsidized by China, which is a very interesting way to adapt the existing rules to a new reality. And also, just as a very brief footnote, if you look at the decision by the European Commission when they applied this, they even have a very interesting interpretation of the public body formula that you have in which is a very contentious one in the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures of the WTO, and the EU has its own interpretation there, which is very interesting for those who are trade geeks and want to see that. The other enforcement example that I think the EU provides is the new regulation that they're devising to extend their rules on state aid, to curb state aid within the EU, to extend these rules to foreign subsidies, so as to address what they considered subsidized foreign investments. So it's a very interesting thing, because they are trying to respond to foreign investments that are subsidized, not only by using their investment screening, their novel investment screening mechanisms, but also by creating a new set of rules, well, actually extending the scope of an existing set of rules that only applies to state EU state aid to foreign investments. I think these to me are very interesting examples of how the EU is trying to update their regulatory and enforcement toolbox to address these concerns. But if you allow me just to move very briefly to another set of regulatory measures, which is more, let's say, maybe proactive, but I think this is something that we should consider. As I said before, I think there's a lot of what's going on that we see that manifests itself as, or is framed as, security questions. And of course, as trade lawyers, for example, you are then tempted to think about, well, so that means that national security exceptions will very likely be expanded. And certainly there is a pressure to do that. But when we let's say enlarge our lenses and look at all the other things that are happening that are interrelated to this, that are not security framed, but they are considered strategic, you see a lot of other measures, such as I mentioned before, industrial policies, subsidies, that will have an impact on another set of trade rules. So if we look at this, these developments that we're looking only from the angle of security, you are tempted to think that everything passes by and exclusively by the national security exception. When you open your let's say, when you broaden the way you view and you approach these developments, you see that other rules are also being challenged. So when you talk about subsidies and things such as, for example, friend and ally shoring, which is something you find in a recent Biden government report on supply chains, you start to see that important, let's say, principles of trade law, such as non-discrimination, national treatment, most favored nation, these are things that will probably very likely be challenged, because you're talking about reshaping your supply sources, or favoring the national supplier instead of the foreign supplier. And I think these are questions that we have to start addressing. As Lauren mentioned, we don't have a lot of concrete elements. I think the notion that she puts on the table of breadcrumbs is a very good one, because we have announcements, some statements of possible policies, but we don't have concrete measures yet. But what we do have, they seem to point to a possible challenge of these fundamental principles of trade law, such as non-discrimination and national treatment.
Great, thank you, Enrique. And I think we're hearing a bunch of, so I think it might be ironic for a roundtable discussing questions about security, but I have to say, hearing all of this makes me feel somewhat anxious. I don't know if anybody in the audience or any of you feel the same way, but I think it's getting at some of the concern that's definitely out there, which is why we want to work through this. I'm curious, we're hearing about all these actions that are being taken, and various different actors who may feel targeted or may be concerned about what other actors are doing. How are you seeing others react to these various different actions and regulations? So maybe Lauren, I'll start with you. You can maybe give us a sense of how businesses are reacting to this kind of uncertainty, how perhaps the advice is changing that you give to businesses. Then maybe we'll come back to Maggie and Sarah and Enrique.
Yeah. So what was the old line? Education. So this seems caution. You're never going to remove the risk of doing international business, and you're never going to remove the willingness to take a risk from the international business people that make those decisions. But right now, we're seeing kind of this incredibly heightened sense of caution. When you look at investment decisions, whether it's CFIUS, whether it's, as Sarah mentioned, there's been kind of this expansion of investment regulations. I know India had quite a few that they ramped up, particularly during COVID, in response to concerns that, other entities were coming in at bargain prices. The Pandora Papers, the UK has started looking into really carefully looking at investments. And so there's a risk that what had been sort of this natural mechanism of international business isn't so natural anymore and isn't so guaranteed anymore. You're seeing more voluntary filings for CFIUS. You have the choice of mandatory, well, not the choice, but you're either a mandatory filing or voluntary filing, depending on what's involved in the investment. And generally, you would kind of see a few voluntary filings to get the safe harbor protections that come to protect you from these reviews that we've been talking about. But now you're seeing it for transactions that 2 years ago would not have gone through the process and expense of doing a voluntary filing. And so it's that recognition of risk. With export controls and sanctions, you're seeing this recognition of risk that companies are avoiding transactions that actually are allowed. The transaction itself is completely allowable under US law, under US regulations, but they're opting out of it because it has the appearance of being contrary to US national security or foreign policy interests, which is kind of the buzzword quagmires of the entity list. And so you're seeing, transactions that would be quite profitable abandoned for fear of how they appear, not how they actually operate in compliance. And then, kind of looking at the government sphere, talking about these competing regulatory and legal requirements, again, between the US and China, but, they're kind of the elephant in the room when we talk about sort of the trade war and what's going on there and some of these hard decisions the businesses have to make. Right now, and part of this is because we've not really seen what the enforcement looks like from the Chinese government on a lot of these new regulations. But right now, businesses seem to be consistently choosing to comply with US law. And if that puts them in violation of, say, the anti-foreign sanctions law in China, that's a choice they're making. And so it leaves open this question of, what does that mean for China? It's unclear, but it does seemingly set the stage to kind of have increasing escalation and even harder choices for businesses going forward.
So Maggie, you were talking about the China initiative and kind of how the effect that's been having. Do you have any sense of how people are reacting to it, either the end of it, scientists or universities or China, and sort of watching this happening?
Yeah, there's been a lot of reactions from different fronts. So so first of all, it does involve businesses, and that there are concerns about intellectual property held by businesses, and the early prosecutions under it. You get the Huawei cases, and you get the Washington with there was the T-Mobile Tappy the robot, the robot arm that was quite literally taken allegedly. That was but there's a lot of this is focused on universities, and why? It's because there's a lot of government money that goes to universities. These NIH, NSF, three-letter agency grants. I'm learning. I haven't done this much with scientists since I had to take some astronomy in undergrad to fulfill a science requirement. But I mean, I find myself on these calls with literally like Nobel laureates in physics. And I'm like, I want you in your lab. I don't want you worried about how your research is going to be looked at. And again, that's not to say it's not concerns, that I do think there are reasons to say the US needs to do a rethink about research security. The open science model, which has made the United States such a leader in innovation, comes with vulnerabilities. It comes with risks, and those risks need to be managed. And perhaps we're at a juncture where there needs to be less openness in the name of national security. However, if that is going to be a shift, it needs to be decided with the right people in the room who are bringing expertise and not just driven by national security people. So for example, I'm excited about having the science advisor be elevated in the Biden administration compared with under Trump. And so we have Eric Lander at OSTP, the Office of Science Technology Policy. And he's been on the record in interviews saying the rules are confusing when it comes to even disclosure requirements. So I think this is all to say, I mean, if anything good can come out of this, it's, having the right people think about where are the real risks. And I like the small yard, high fence approach, which came from former Defense Secretary Gates. And then I got it from my friend Sam Sachs, who does all sorts of tech stuff, that let's figure out what we want to protect. What are the real national security concerns? And then let's build a dang high fence around them and protect them from threats wherever they emanate. Because guess what? People from places other than China steal intellectual property. And so that's where I'm at. And then finally, I just say that another thing that I've seen is a lot of the advocacy communities pulling together. I do a lot of work with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Brennan Center, ACLU, amnesty. And again, these concerns about how foreign policy, trade policy, national security are impacting the US domestically, and particularly AAPI communities. And I think that's very real. None of us, I don't think here, represent those, but I believe a lot in allyship, and then I'd like to see more people not from the AAPI communities themselves working on these issues, because it is important to everyone to have a strong economy.
I mean, it's a powerful point about how, as we expand our notion of national security, we also have to expand our notion of who needs to be at the table and talking about what national security entails. Sarah and Enrique, and both of you mentioned, and Sarah, you may want to comment on some of this stuff too, but both of you have mentioned the ways in which some of these actions have kind of third parties that are affected, third party states, right, who may either be affected in kind of this extraterritorial application way, or as sort of bystanders who may see kind of their companies kind of falling into this. Any thoughts on how these states are reacting to this?
Yeah, and to build on a couple of things that Maggie and Lauren mentioned, especially when it comes to who is making decisions over these kind of policies, I think that one of the things that is a benefit to the CFIUS system is that it is an interagency approach. And so that means that Commerce is in the room, Treasury obviously leads, DOJ is thinking about potential kind of legal challenges and so forth. And so I think that if CFIUS was a body that was just defense and the intelligence community, it would make very different choices about what kinds of transactions to clear and which ones to mitigate or block. And so I think that it is really important, as we increase the number of regulatory bodies that are reviewing transactions of any kind, that we make sure that different voices that are going to have different perspectives are have a place at the table. The other point that Maggie mentioned about kind of about open science and concerns around there, I think really dovetails nicely into the new US-EU Trade and Technology Council, which met for the first time at the end of September and is concerned about many things, including export controls and science. And so that leads me into kind of my broader point that there are kind of two ways that we can think about the ways that governments have responded to these types of regulatory kind of changes. One is actually around building coalitions. And so the US-EU Trade and Technology Council is an example of a coalitional approach that is challenging, right? But the idea here, at least from the US perspective, is we want to keep science open, but open within kind of trusted partners and allies. Is that something that we can do? Or is that going to prove too much of a challenge, because our partners and allies may not have the same types of concerns and may not want to, to wall off the same types of technologies that we have concerns about. So we are going to see more and more of these kinds of summits and approaches to trying to find who are our allies here. Can we expand a coalition around these issues? Because a lot of times unilateral action is not very useful here, and that kind of gets me to some of Lauren's points on export controls. Export controls are really fascinating, I think underappreciated in the academic community, and very closely tied with the changes to the investment security regime, because when FIRMA, which was the update to the CFIUS rules, was passed, it was passed basically because it was able to have a companion piece of legislation called ECRA, which was the Export Control Reform Act, that basically controlled outgoing technology, because CFIUS only controls inward investment, not outward investment. And an initial version of the FIRMA bill would have also allowed CFIUS to review outward investment, and the compromise was to strengthen export controls. And the reason why that is important is because why export controls is important is because in ECRA, the kind of in the legislation, it makes clear that in order for the U.S. government, through which commerce leads this kind of component, but in order for the U.S. government to control emerging and critical technologies that are not currently controlled, it needs to have a reasonable expectation that it is going to be able to push forward a multilateral control, which traditionally has been through the Wassenaar process, but for various reasons, we might expect that there might be a smaller group of countries that control these sorts of technologies in a multilateral fashion. And the reason why that's important is because if the US is going around controlling things, but only in a unilateral fashion, that technology is still going to leak out, and US firms are going to be disadvantaged because they will not be able to transact in those technologies, but every other country, firms from every other country in the world will. And so for that reason, as we move forward with these kinds of new regulations, that sort of it becomes even more important for there to be some amount of coordination among allies and partners. And so it'll be interesting to see what sorts of things those allies and partners can agree to and what things they can't.
Thanks. Enrique, do you have any thoughts on sort of how maybe bystander states are watching this, perhaps quickly?
As long as I don't speak on behalf of Brazil as a bystander. No, but so let me just concur entirely with what Sarah has just said. I think one interesting development that we see, again, taking a step back and looking from a certain distance, what we see, it is interesting to see the concept of allies being applied to economic relations, right? It's not something that we were really used to when you, for example, when you look at, I mean, I would guess that if you take a very thick volume on WTO law, it's very hard to find the word ally there, I think. But it is a sign of the times we're living. And just picking up on something that Sarah mentioned, it is really interesting to see that there seems to be a trend towards the building of coalitions, of economic coalition of states, of like-minded states, to sort of find responses. And I agree with her. I don't know whether responses will be able to be identified, because the logics are different, right? The market moves not by whether you're a democracy or whether you uphold human rights necessarily, right? The logics not only converge. So is it possible to create a coalition, economic coalition of democracies, but leaving outside those countries that are considered not to be democracies? How would that play out? It's really tricky. But now jumping to the role of bystanders. I think it is important to bear in mind when you try to understand what third countries are doing, the concrete measures in place. There's not much happening, and I think there's a lot of policy announcements and statements, but so far I don't think there is enough concrete measures in place for most of the countries to find the need to take a full blown reaction, right? What you do see, I think, are so of course China has been adopting, maybe in reaction to the strengthening of regulations in the US, their own set of reinforcing their investment screening mechanisms, their own set of domestic measures. But other than that, I don't think there is enough, let's say, concrete policy changes to induce third countries to start properly reacting. I think, with the risk of putting everybody together in the same situation, but I think as a general remark, I think most countries are waiting to see what changes will concretely be implemented.
Okay, great. So I want to get to a broader kind of question here about where we think things are going. And I also want to bring in some of the Q&A, but I do need for business purposes here to share the CLE code right now. Hopefully you can all see that, and I'll just read it out to all of you. It is 297521. So again, the CLE code for this is 297521. Hopefully you all saw that. But coming back to this broader question, right? So, where do you see this going? What are you most concerned about? What are you watching out for? What does the future of regulation look like? And I'll just start things off here. For me, and I think this picks up on some themes that all of you have brought out. Right, invoking national security does a number of things at the same time. Right, first, national security evokes an emotion. Right, it evokes a sense of fear or concern that something is at risk, and this makes it a particularly powerful political tool. This can be really valuable in raising consciousness. Right, thinking back to climate, something we haven't talked that much about. But one worry is that without clearly defined meanings for national security, it becomes an easy target for political opportunists. A way to give a pet issue salience and to get built-in policy allies for your particular concerns. This connects to a second thing that invoking national security does, a second concern, that invoking security often triggers exceptional powers, often lodged in the executive, and this includes prosecutors. So going back to Maggie, your point, and these powers are often ones that are shrouded in secrecy. They're rarely as transparent as non-security processes. This is why we should be very concerned about making sure that we can make sure that these are as transparent and open as possible. Secrecy, flexibility, and discretion are all often really important for national security. But if the topics that we're talking about here are ill-defined, we need to start worrying about transparency, predictability, and accountability. For individuals, coming back to Maggie, your point, this can be disastrous. But even on a broader scale, how can we really organize relations? How can we do business? How can we make deals? Going back to Lauren, your point, if we don't know ultimately what laws will apply. And then third, I'll just put on the table, security invokes for us at different times both the gravity of the threat, right? So when we talk about security, it sort of tells us this is something particularly severe, right? It also invokes for us notions of protection of the national interest, right? That's the national security side of this. One thing that I worry a little bit about is that the way in which our politics operate, it becomes very easy to elide those two meanings, right? The severity of the concern with the national interest. Climate change, pandemics, they definitely threaten our security, right? They make us feel less secure. I mean, we all feel less secure right now, but are they matters of national security? The same can be said for jobs and economic health. The easy elision should make us tamp the brakes at least a little to make sure we're headed in the right direction. But let me turn things over back to you to see what things you're thinking about as kind of where the future is on all of this, where things are going. Maybe Maggie, I can start with you.
So I'm worried about the U.S.-China relationship. It's the worst I've seen it, and I've been in this game now quite a while. When did we graduate from law school there, as classmates? But, and I say this being in Taiwan, which of course is in the news because it feels that threat in a particular way. So, but, I worry when I hear all about like a lot of throwing around of Cold War, new Cold War, Cold War 2.0, because no, I mean, the world is at a totally different place, totally different economic integration. This is not a new Cold War. I really worry when I hear too, where the word engagement with China has become this terrible word that somehow if you engage with China, you are, complicit or at least sort of naive or coddling, and decoupling is being thrown around. So I think we need to find a way to maintain connectivity with China, because we are an integrated world, while being clear-eyed about when there are threats and not being overblown in those threats. Because I also am concerned what I hear coming out of DC with this, almost everyone's a hawk now, but it's kind of like, where on the taxonomy of hawks are you? Are you like an Uber hawk, or, and those are the things that worry me, is this really just sort of having that emotion take over, and in doing so, not only is there the collateral damage, as I said, of particularly people who are Chinese ethnically or by nationality, and we have a long history in the United States of treating those communities really poorly. So I worry about them in particular, but just more generally, you know, where does that take us? And it's to a darker place, not to a better place. And so here I'm just going to throw out a book recommendation because we're academics. Ryan Haas, who's at Brookings, and he's got a book out there called Stronger, and it's about the U.S.-China relationship. He was in the NSC under Obama, and making the point of, you know, when you see Xi Jinping, he doesn't talk about the United States all the time. The US talks about China all the time. Can we just talk about making ourselves stronger? Because guess what? People in the United States need faster train, like real fast trains, not the Acela that doesn't count, and need bridges that work and roads that work, not because China's building bridges and roads, because we need them. And so I think a lot of this too is about not having everything be put in this competitive and negative competitive framing.
Hey, Sarah, do you want to jump in here?
So I too am quite worried, and to build on these kind of issues of the overuse of national security frames and the over securitization of a lot of these issues, one of the reasons why I didn't bring up environmental concerns here is because I really don't think that the right way to address climate change and the types of technologies that we need to proliferate throughout the world in order to adequately address these issues. I do not believe that a national security frame is the way to go about doing this, because it creates us versus them. It makes it very hard to collaborate across countries that, you know, are not natural allies and partners, in particular US and China, which there needs to be collaboration there in order to address that problem. And so for me, you know, I think that it would be nice if our politicians and our kind of collective conversation could move towards trying to take out that security frame as much as possible. The problem is that it is politically expedient to frame things within a national security frame, and because of our dysfunction in our own political system, you know, if you frame something as a national security issue, you can get bipartisan support. If you don't, it will become a question about the role of government and kind of, bickering about the politics of redistribution. And that makes it really challenging to move away from those security frames. But for me, the thing that I am, you know, most worried about is I do not understand how a globally integrated economy can continue if we move down this particular path of the US and maybe the EU and some other partners sort of working together to develop more and more regulations, and then the PRC kind of putting in place countermeasures like the recent blocking rules that Lauren mentioned that are fundamentally in opposition to each other. And so I just don't know where we are, how we can continue to have a globally integrated world if we continue on the path that we are on. And I worry about the fallout of actually having severe decoupling happening. So.
Thanks. So Lauren and Rick, I want to come to you on this too. I'll just put on the table because we only have 5 minutes left, and people can come back in on this. We did have 2 questions in the queue, one dealing with the regulation of cryptocurrency and one with outer space. So just have those on your mind in case if you want to chime in on either of those as new areas of security and competition. But Lauren, Enrique, anything that you want to add in terms of things that you're watching for, things that concern you?
Sure, just really quickly, I'm concerned in the short term that this lack of clear, defined policy guidance from the Biden administration leaves a vacuum in which Congress can set the tone, and they have. And that this scrutiny of commerce really increases the pressure on them, and it tends to pull course into a more hawkish direction. And where that can lead is, as we touched on before, it's much more politically expeditious in a lot of ways, lateral controls. when we're talking about export controls. And as we said before, between unilateral and multilateral, unilateral controls are worse for US businesses. It makes it harder for them. And on top of that, if we are facing kind of this, and not to bother Maggie with the with evoking a Cold War analogy, but a regulatory arms race between the US and China, that can really put businesses in an impossible situation. And if a business is in a situation where they're having to make impossible choices, then we can be left with, really unthinkable results. And so that's really kind of where we're watching and where we're building, I'm afraid.
Maybe I should add a non-US look on this question. So I completely agree with Maggie. I think framing what is happening as a new Cold War is really misleading. It doesn't help, and it misses a lot of the nuances of where we are now. But where are we now? To me, I think we're in a transition period where you see government in, let's say, incumbent key economies trying to operate a reaccommodation of power to see where they stand and to see whether they can, how distribution of economic power, let's put it this way, will play out now that China has emerged. So it is I think it's a push and shove moment where actors will try a number of measures to curb, China's acquisition of technologies, the building of capacity, say scientific capacity by China. So you have different measures taking place, not only to, as I mentioned before, to defend your capabilities, but also the ones that you have from being acquired or shared to countries that you don't trust, but also to build back better your capabilities. But it is a transitional period going somewhere that nobody knows. I think nobody knows where this will end. But what we do know is that obviously the multilateral system that has governed trade, finance, it will also be affected by that. We don't know how much, but I think we could safely expect that, for example, when you look at trade regulation, it is going to be very difficult that first, we should be expecting to agree on single undertaking packages. I think the tendency will be more to have groups of countries, coalitions, or what have you, behind a number of common rules, but not everybody. Now, which sectors will play out by these rules or this format of rules? It's still something that is unclear. I find it, I don't think we have elements enough to draw categorical conclusions about where we're going, because I think we're still in this transitional period. And only time, diplomacy, the work of business, these things will shape where we will land, but I don't think we know where we will land. Hopefully, in a place where we, hopefully we get there peacefully, and I think certainly the intention by everybody is. But how this will play out, I think it's something that we don't know.
So I think we've reached the end of our time, but I think that's actually a good note to end on. And one thing I really hope for, and I'm really grateful to all of you for joining me on this, is that each of us are following different aspects of this story. I mean, that's sort of what we're doing in our daily lives. And, we're trying to figure out how to make sense of the particular regulations coming out here, or the particular actions being taken there, or the particular threats that may be emerging in some other area. But I hope that what we've been able to do today is to be able to try to pull back a little bit and think about what more broadly is going on here beyond any one of these particular regulatory areas, and how we need to think about kind of where the world is going, and how we might be able to kind of push it or pull it in various different directions. So let me thank all of you. Thank you to Maggie, to Laura, to Enrique, to Sarah. Thank you to all of you out there in the audience. And thank you, of course, to the organizers of International Law Weekend. Hopefully this will be a continuing conversation. And I would say, if you're interested in these topics, these are the people you should be following to hear more about this. So thank you to everyone.
And thank you to Harlan for organizing such a wonderful panel.
Thanks, Harlan.
Yes, thank you. Thank